Welcome.
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 Welcome to the unlikely
Seminarian.
Welcome to the Unlikely Seminarian.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Unlikely Seminarian podcast. I'm your host, Dan Cook, and I thank you, as always, for taking the time to listen. So this is part 2 of our series on the problem of evil. And in the last episode, we sort of defined the problem of evil. Evil exists in the world, in a world created by an all-good and all-powerful God. How can that be? If God is all-powerful, he should be able to eradicate evil. If God is all-good, he should want to eradicate evil. So how can evil, therefore, exist? Is it a matter of God not being all-powerful? He can't eradicate all evil? Or is it a matter of God not being all good? He could eradicate all evil, but chooses not to. And as we talked about in the last episode, that's a very understandable and logical binary that I personally happen to reject. And I reject it on the basis of my thought that there is a third way. And that third way, and I didn't get too much into this in the last episode, but we're going to get into it here, is centered around the notion of free will. That to say that God doesn't eradicate all evil because he chooses not to, ergo he is not all good, ignores a very important reality, and that reality is free will. If God has given agents, and we talked about the potential of spiritual agents in the last episode as well as human agents, if God has given agents in the world the ability to make choices for which they are responsible, if he has given them free will, those agents are only truly free to exercise that will to the degree that they're able to exercise it either in the direction God wants or in the opposite direction from what God wants. God has a vision, God has a purpose, God has a meaning, God has a trajectory for his creation that he'd like to see it take. But for human beings or spiritual agents, if they are truly to be free to exercise their will, then they have to have the ability to choose against what God wants. And given the existence of sin in the world, it is therefore almost inevitable that some of those agents are going to choose to do something the opposite of what God wants. Hence, evil is in the world via avenues which are not sourced to God, and God's choice not to snap his fingers and eradicate it isn't out of a sense of God not being all good, but is from a sense of God knowing how creation is inextricably linked together. All of creation is linked in very finely tuned and difficult for finite-minded individuals like human beings in ways it's difficult for those folks to understand. Where do I get that from? Well, I also get that from the book of Job. So the basic structure of the book of Job is all this bad stuff happens to Job, really, really bad stuff. And he laments it. He doesn't necessarily curse God, but he laments that all this bad stuff has happened to him. Some of his friends show up, and his friends have this legalistic idea that bad stuff only happens to people who deserve it. Ergo, if bad stuff is happening to Job, he must have done something to deserve it. As much as Job insists he's done nothing to deserve this, and we know via the nature of the story that he hasn't done anything to deserve this, his friends are trying to instruct him, no, you must have done something, because if you haven't done something, then that means bad stuff can happen to good people for no reason, and we refuse to accept that that can happen because then it could happen to us for no reason, and we don't want to believe that that's a possible reality. So we'd rather insist that you, Job, have done something to deserve these bad things that happen to you than try to wrap our heads around the reality that random bad stuff, or seemingly random bad stuff, can happen to people who haven't done anything to deserve it, because that's terrifying. Then we realize we have no control over the world, and that's a reality that those particular friends, and many people who you and I know, or who you and I are unwilling or scared to actually accept as a reality. So the friends come along and they do their thing, and this, of course, upsets Job, who then starts to get pretty close to cursing God territory. And after all this, after the friends have had their say, after Job has had their say, finally God shows up. And God shows up in a way only God can, in a very loving fashion, where he says, guys, you all have it wrong. And not only do you all have it wrong, but if I were to actually explain everything that you would need to know to totally understand why you're wrong, we'd essentially be here for the rest of your lives, and your brains would most likely melt and fall out of your ears. I'm paraphrasing. But here's where I highlight my point. If you look at Job late in chapter 40, I'm looking at verse 15, through the first few verses of chapter 41, here's what it says. Look at Behemoth, Behemoth being a mythical monster. Look at Behemoth, which I made just as I made you. This is God speaking. It eats grass like an ox, its strength is in its loins, and its power in the muscles of its belly. It makes its tail stiff like a cedar, the sinews of its thighs are knit together, its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs like bars of iron. It's kind of a badass animal. It is the first of the great acts of God. Only its maker can approach it with the sword. For the mountains yield food for it, where all the wild animals play. Under the lotus plants it lies, in the covert of the reeds, and in the marsh. The lotus trees cover it for shade, the willows of the wadi surround it. Even if the river is turbulent, it is not frightened. It is confident, though Jordan rushes against its mouth. Can one take it with hooks, or pierce its nose with a snare? This is where we get into chapter 41. Can you draw out Leviathan? Leviathan's a sea monster. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down its tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in its nose, or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it make many supplications to you? Will it speak soft words to you? Will it make a covenant with you to be taken as your servant forever? And it goes on from there. So what are these verses trying to tell us? Behemoth is this land monster, Leviathan is this sea monster. And I want to particularly highlight the fact that with Leviathan and the sea monster, the sea in many ancient cultures, including ancient Hebrew culture, is seen as the source of chaos, is seen as that which is uncontrollable, is seen as that which threatens to overwhelm the assumed control of humanity. And that spirit, that idea, that lack of control, that overwhelming presence crystallizes often in the form of some sort of monster. In this case, it's Leviathan. Behemoth is essentially its land-based brother. And so that's why we see these descriptions, especially of Behemoth, as this powerful, overwhelming, unassailable force. And what God basically is saying is, can you handle these monsters? Well, no, of course you can't, not in the way that they're described, especially not in the way he describes handling them, drawing out Leviathan with a fish hook, taking Behemoth with hooks, or piercing its nose with a snare. Of course not. Of course these things can't be done. And this is where God's trying to explain to Job and his friends in a way that they can maybe wrap their heads around what he has to deal with in this creation. That there are spirits, that there are forces, that there are things involved in creation that man can't possibly, not only that can't possibly hope to control, but can't possibly begin to wrap their head around in any kind of understanding fashion. So essentially what God's saying in this sense is, yeah, bad stuff happens. And it does so via forces that I wish you could understand, but know that you can't. Which has always been a frustrating thing for me. I can handle a lot of stuff. What I don't like is, if I don't understand something, you at least have to explain to me why I don't get to understand it. And I think that's essentially what God's doing in the book of Job, is saying to people like me, look, there are forces, there are all kinds of things that are connected together in ways you can't possibly understand. So stop trying to control it. Stop trying to say that bad stuff can only happen to bad people, because that's not how this works. You've heard of the butterfly effect, right? Which is overly simplistic idea, but you get the basic idea, that a butterfly flaps its wings somewhere over in the Himalayas and a hurricane ends up through a result of kind of a domino effect. Then it ends up being a hurricane. Again, grossly oversimplified. But that's sort of the idea God's getting at, is look, things are connected together in ways that your mind can't possibly get around. And if I just stepped in and prevented every evil there was, I'd either A, be robbing people of the free will with which I created them, therefore rendering my creation null and void, or B, if I stepped in and prevented something, there are multiple consequences that come forth from that you can't possibly understand, that I can because I exist outside of space and time. If God's the perfect being that we believe him to be, and he has perfectly created his creation with agents with free will, then he cannot subvert that will at his whim and discretion, or it's not perfect. So what God has done is saying, I want to create a creation with beings that have free will, because I want to have the kind of relationship that I have in the Trinity with these beings. I want to have this back and forth, mutual understanding, mutual love, mutual affection, mutual worship, mutual glorifying type relationship with my creation. And the only way that that works is if they choose to be in that relationship with me. Ergo, I have to give them free will such that they choose that relation. They have the ability to choose that relationship. But they only have the ability to choose that relationship to the degree that they have the ability to choose something other than that relationship. And as they choose something other than that relationship, you bring evil into the world. So if I'm going to stop evil, that means I have to stop them from choosing against that relationship, at least to some degree. And now I have just robbed them of free will. So it's this weird kind of circular argument where God literally can't. Not because he's not all good, not because he's not all-powerful, but because he's designed the world to work in such a way that in order to be true to himself, which he is endlessly, he has to allow these events to proceed. Now, because God's all-powerful, he has the ability to try and influence us. It doesn't mean that he stops us from doing anything. It means he tries to influence us through other people, through spirits, through spiritual beings, through any number of ways where he tries to get to us and remind us of our purpose, remind us of our design, remind us of what we are created to be, remind us that the best possible outcome for our lives is found through choosing him and choosing to follow his design for creation. So why is any of this important? How do we put this in any kind of practical effect? Well, we'll take a run at that in the next episode. I hope you'll join me. Until then, my name is Dan Cook, and you've been listening to The Unlikely Seminarian.